Well, clinical psychologist Dr. Jordan Peterson is one of the world's most famous and fascinating intellectuals. His books are instant bestsellers. Tens of millions watch him online. In fact, his last interview on Piers Morgan Uncensored has so far been viewed more than 17 million times. And I'm delighted to say that he joins me again now. Jordan, great to have you back on the programme.
Well, thanks, Piers. It's good to see you again.
I was absolutely astonished, really. Maybe I shouldn't have been, but by the reaction to our last interview worldwide. The sheer volume of people that watched the whole interview, the way the clips were disseminated on TikTok, on Facebook, on Twitter. It was a really interesting insight, actually, into a whole world that doesn't even involve, actually, conventional television anymore. I guess you wouldn't be surprised because this happens to you a lot, but I was. What does it say about society that number of people can watch an interview on a computer or phone?
Well, I'm still continually surprised about it, but well, I think what it shows is that there's really no way that legacy TV, in some real sense, can compete with the absolutely wide open frontier of online video distribution, where the cost is low and people can access it everywhere. It's fundamentally the consequence of a technological revolution, and there's all sorts of good things about that, and one of those would be the ability to widely disperse complex and sophisticated information, which YouTube has been particularly good at in the long form, but it's also problematic in that it produces all sorts of alterations in social behavior that we're only, and some of them very dangerous, many of which we're only just beginning to understand.
Right. Elon Musk has just bought Twitter and it's creating a huge furore, obviously, in many different ways. And he's admitted, I'm going to do lots of things in the next few months and we're going to get some wrong and we're going to pull them and try something else. He's going to try and work out a way of making it a sustainable business model. But also he wants to bring back what he perceives to be genuine free speech on the platform. Is it possible, Jordan, do you think, that he can do that? Or are we now so entrenched in tribalism, particularly on social media, that it's almost impossible to do what he wants to do?
Well, you couldn't have picked a better day to talk about this with me, because I just got a paper sent to me today by Jonathan Haidt. He didn't write the paper. It will be published. It's published in a journal called Personality and Individual Differences, and it's an examination of the personality traits associated with, let's say, excessive and self-promoting internet usage. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read you a couple of the descriptions of what the people found, because it's so absolutely spot on and relevant. I don't think we are descending into tribalism. I think what's happening is that the virtualization of the world is enabling people who behave in a particular antisocial way, in a self-grandizing and self-promoting antisocial way. And I'll just read you the descriptions that are taken directly from this paper. So it was an actual study of online behavior. Women characterized by high self-centered antagonism, neurotic narcissism, Machiavellian views, Machiavellian tactics, so that's manipulativeness, meanness, disinhibition, physical sadism, and indirect sadism, used Instagram for a longer time and more frequently than did men. In women, verbal sadism and emotionality was associated with longer, while honesty, humility, and conscientiousness was with a shorter Facebook usage time. Furthermore, women high in agentic extroversion, so that's manipulative self-promotion, and indirect sadism used Facebook for a longer time and more frequently than men. And so I've thought for a while that one of the things that's happening to us as we virtualize the world is that we're enabling the small percentage of people, it's usually about 3% in general populations, who use manipulation and reputation savaging and denigration and self-promotion, so the genuinely psychopathic types, to dominate the social conversation and to spew their poisonous and manipulative venom into the public domain, not only with no fear of being stopped and no inhibition, which is almost all applied socially, but also while being monetized and promoted by the people who run the social media channels. And every society forever has had to contend with a small percentage of people who will utilize all the benefits of society only for themselves. They had to contend with the fact that those people, if not brought under control, can demolish the structure of the entire society. And I think the polarization that we're feeling is a consequence of their untrammeled expression online, Instagram, Facebook, and in online comment forums like Twitter.
But that stuff you read out just seemed to be gender specific to women. Presumably it also applies in other ways to men as well on social media.
Oh yeah, well I think the reason that it applied in this study in women is because Instagram is very heavy image use. It involves heavy use of images, and there are reasons to assume that because of that, it attracts women who are directed towards short-term impulsive mating strategies, and that's another sign of impulsive, antisocial, and psychopathic behavior. I think you'd see the same thing in men. In fact, I've been talking to psychologists, great psychologists, to make sure that I'm on the right track here about those who post repeatedly, say, in online forums, especially in relationship to comments, and you certainly see that same pattern of sadism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism characterizing the men who are also incentivized to use what used to be classic female antisocial strategies to advance themselves in the reputational hierarchy.
But the bottom line is...
Exploiters, fundamentally.
Right, but the bottom line is that there is a small percentage of people generating a vast amount of noise. What impact is that happening on society, do you think?
Well, I think it skews our perceptions of what normal people are like. We assume that what we're getting, you know, when you sample the world, when you're walking through it, you make the assumption that you're getting an unbiased representation of the things going on around you. And when you're on an online platform and, say, reading comments, you also have the assumption that what you're seeing is something like a sample of public opinion. But it's not. You know, because if 10 strangers came up to you randomly in the street, then you'd have a bit of a sample of what people randomly think. But behavior online isn't random, and the people who post aren't precisely normal. And I have been talking with Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge about this, and I think they might know more about it than anybody else in the world. And it's pretty clear that the people who are dominating, say, online comment sections, and I would especially say this is true of the people who post anonymously, and there's other markers for this sort of behavior as well, they dominate the political discourse. And what's happening in some sense is that we have a new form of pollution that's also corporate sponsored, and it's pollution of the domain of public discourse. And the pollution occurs because the social media companies are either enabling or failing to control, you know, those known in the popular parlance as trolls, but they're not just comical trolls, you know, using derision in some cute way and having their say in the free speech domain. They're really poisonous individuals, and they're poisoning the entire domain of discourse.
So what can Elon Musk do? What can Elon Musk do about it, do you think? If you were advising him on this, I mean, ironically, at the moment, you're not on Twitter. Do you want to come back now that Musk is in charge? Do you think you should be restored? Do you want to be back on Twitter? And secondly, what would you advise him to do about this issue of the trolls and so on?
Well, the first thing I would advise, and I'm going to be advising the political people I'll be talking to over the next few weeks of precisely this, and I have talked it over with Twenge and Haidt to make sure that I'm not, like I said, off on a personal tangent. I would say there's no excuse for including the anonymous posters with the real human beings. And I think that social media platforms who have a certain reach, maybe it's 1 million subscribers, and I don't really know what figure is appropriate, should be required to implement know your customer laws, and then that the people who are posting who are genuine, verified human beings willing to abide by their words with their personal reputation should be put in one comment section, and then the online, anonymous, cowardly, narcissistic, pathological troll demons who are polluting the public discourse should be put in a different comment section. And if you want to go to hell and visit the troll demons and see what they have to spew, you can, but otherwise you can be among the normal human beings engaged in normal civil human discourse. Right. And that would separate the bloody psychopaths from the bulk of decent, normal people. And, you know, 97% of people aren't psychopathic. Yeah. And so we are talking about a small minority here, but they have the upper hand. See, there's a percentage of people who...
I had a psychopath test done on me, actually. a lengthy questionnaire, and they concluded I was a good psychopath.
And what do they mean by that exactly? Do you know?
Apparently, I wasn't like the malevolent version. It was slightly lost on me, the nuance.
Okay, well, okay, look. It's often the case that people in the industry that you're in, and this would be true for politics and journalism as well, anything with a public face, are more likely to be extroverted and also more likely to be somewhat disagreeable. And those personality traits can tilt you towards, what would you say, a style of callous exploitation. But there are other personality factors that mediate against that, like conscientiousness. And so people who are hardworking and reliable, for example, aren't parasitic in the same way that a classic psychopath would be. And so it's complicated, and it isn't the case that extroversion and even a certain degree of disagreeableness in and of themselves are dangerous, but they lead, like everybody's led to temptation in the direction that's in accordance with their temperament, and the fact that you are a public-facing person and that you like that would tilt you in one direction of potential temptation, but that's not necessarily diagnostic. Now, it is a problem because it probably is the case that politics and journalism and entertainment attract a disproportionate number of Machiavellians and psychopaths because of the status that goes along with those enterprises.
Yeah.
But it's not diagnostic. It doesn't mean that if you're in that industry, and you've had a long career, and that's also another marker for failure or for lack of psychopathy, because in the normal world, psychopaths exploit, and they get a reputation for doing so quite quickly. And then people avoid them and stop working with them. And so it doesn't work over the medium to long run as a general rule.
Yeah, I get it. Last time we spoke at length, you said afterwards we forgot to get round to Donald Trump. And you were quite keen to talk about Donald Trump. So we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, I do want to talk about Trump, because the big question right now in America is Trump done? Jordan, Donald Trump, what is he? Is he a narcissist, a sociopath, a psychopath? All of those things? None of them?
I don't think that he's a psychopath because he's been successful in repeated enterprises over long periods of time, and he has a variety of people who remain intensely loyal to him. Now, he's definitely extroverted to a very great degree, and he's definitely disagreeable. And so that gives him some of the traits that are associated with those personality features. But from what I've been able to understand, he's also very conscientious and hardworking, for example. And so that's a real mitigating factor. And so I think it's very easy to demonize someone that you don't approve of, let's say, and certainly Trump has been subject, I would say, to more demonization than any political leader in the West that I can remember in my entire lifetime, including Richard Nixon. And so that's also set him back on his heels and made him somewhat embattled and defensive, which I don't think did any great things for his personality in some real sense. So I think it's a mistake to assume that Trump is a psychopath. I think it's a big mistake. I think it's a big mistake to assume that Putin is a psychopath. It's easy to do that, but I don't think the evidence suggests that. You don't want to throw those labels around casually. And if Trump was psychopathic, well, he did a pretty good job of keeping the United States clear of war for 4 years. That's pretty damn remarkable. And he did have a big hand in promoting the Abraham Peace Accords, and that was pretty remarkable. And those aren't the sorts of things that you would expect from a psychopath. He also seems to have a pretty good hand with the working class. So I don't think those are reasonable diagnostic labels to.
You're sounding like I wouldn't say
place on someone.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you sound like you're a bit of a fan of Donald Trump. Would you like him to run again? Would it be good for America, do you think?
No, I don't think it would be good for America. Would it be good for him to run? That's a difficult question, because it might be that it would be good for America to have whether or not Donald Trump should be president sorted out in the public sphere, debated intensely, and subject to an election. So it might be very interesting to see him put himself forward on the Republican ticket. If I had my druthers, and I say this, I hope with due care, I would rather see someone like DeSantis step forward, who shares some of that forthright strength, let's say, that characterizes Trump at his best, but seems to be a more cautious administrator and a less divisive figure. I think that would be better, because Trump, for whatever virtues he might have, and I think he has the virtues of a Washington outsider, I think that's quite clear. I think that his behavior in the political realm raises the political temperature to a dangerous degree.
Yeah.
And, I say that while trying to give the devil his due and not casting careless aspersions on his name.
Yeah, no, exactly. I want to turn to somebody else who may well have presidential ambitions and has been the subject of a lot of negativity. Meghan Markle, Prince Harry's wife, who does this podcast, Archewell podcast, or Archetypes it's called, in which she seems to perennially play the victim, the female victim of all outrages. And your name got dragged into this. Let's take a listen to what she said.
Raise your hand if you've ever been called crazy or hysterical. Or what about nuts, insane, out of your mind, completely irrational?
I don't think that men can control crazy women.
The use of these labels has been drilled into us from movies and TV, from friends and family, and even from random strangers. And the fact is, no one wants this label.
What did you make of that, Jordan, to be suddenly appearing on Meghan Markle's podcast as a villain?
The first
who was
thing I make
calling
of
women
it
crazy
is that the first thing I make of it is that her voice drips with the same falsehood that the voice of Kamala Harris drips with. It's this sanctimonious, faux compassionate, talking down to her audience and trying to be sure that we're all really on the same compassionate page here, and we're all being victimized by terrible forces that are arrayed against us, and none of that's really fair. And it just grates on me. And I do believe, you played a bit of a clip from me when I was talking to Paglia, Camille Paglia, the literary critic. And I do believe that it is the case that it's very difficult to control female antisocial behavior, often of the type that's been pilloried as hysterical. And I think that there is no shortage of clinical evidence to support precisely that claim. It's very difficult for women to control female antisocial behavior, and females who are antisocial, that feminine pattern is reputation savaging under the guise of compassionate care. And it's extraordinarily destructive. And so I stand by my words.
Absolutely.
And I do think it scales online, because you can use an anonymous reputation savaging to unbelievably great effect online with absolutely no punishment for your sins, so to speak. And that is certainly one of the things that's contributing to so-called cancel culture. And there's no shortage of that coming from the female side. Now, men can engage in exactly the same strategies, and they do so online, and that's enabled. But it's definitely, see, with men, and I've said this before, and I do believe this to be the case, the ever-present threat of the potential for physical violence keeps men from doing that to each other most of the time in person. And that all disappears online, and that means that those who are prone to do such things, to use corrosive and denigrating derision, for example, and reputation savaging, can have a free hand at it, and that includes no shortage of women, and women are often, very, very often, the targets of that behavior from their own fellows, so to speak.
We've talked about Trump and Meghan Markle. I wanted to just ask you again about Elon Musk, about what you thought of him as a character. He seems to me a fascinating individual. You know, whether he's slightly on the spectrum or I'm not sure what his makeup is psychologically, but he's certainly a creative genius, a whirlwind, a life force who's done remarkable things. What do you make of him?
Well, I know people who know him very well and have worked with him very closely, and these are very solid people, extremely competent and extremely creative, and they're admirers of Musk. I talked with my brother-in-law, Jim Keller, who's one of the world's great chip engineers, and he worked very closely with Musk for years, and he believes that he's in many ways exactly what you'd think he was. He's a genius, but he's also like a visionary genius, but he's also someone who's very, very good at implementing, very good at running companies, as you can tell, because he has a multitude of impossible successful companies.
Yes.
And so he goes into a company and he cleans house and puts things in order and makes things work efficiently. And maybe he can do that with Twitter. I hope he can, because Musk is doing all sorts of things that appear to be useful and difficult, and it would be a catastrophe to see him derailed in his efforts. And I think he's
Would you like to be back on Twitter,
with Twitter.
Jordan? Would you like to be back on Twitter?
You know, I dipped into Twitter this morning when I was looking at some of the research that I just shared with you, and it instantly struck me the same way it struck me the last time I was on Twitter. It's such a den of pathology that using it, I think, is psychologically damaging. And if it's possible for Musk to get the trolls, and they're not trolls, they're psychopathic, Machiavellian, sadistic narcissists under control, then it's possible that the platform might be useful. I like to share information on it. I like to follow people to see what they were up to, a lot of the people that I've met over the years. But, man, it's a snake pit.
It is. It is a snake pit. It
isn't obvious to me that we know what to do about it.
Before I let you go, Jordan, you're wearing a poppy. I'm wearing a poppy. We're about to have a debate after the break about whether people should be compelled to wear poppies. And I guess this goes to the wider thing about general displays of, I guess, signalling your virtue in any way that you choose. Should anyone be compelled to, whatever the cause, whether it's a black square on Instagram when George Floyd died or a poppy for Armistice Day or so on, should people ever be compelled?
I think that compulsion, especially in matters of public policy, is a sign of bad policy. If you can't get people on board voluntarily by motivating them with the proper story, then you're a poor leader. And so I certainly would be opposed to anything approximating legal compulsion. Now, we use social compulsion frequently to produce consensus, let's say, and to enforce it, and that's never going to go away, and there's some utility in that. But my general take on the world is that people should be allowed to go to hell in a handbasket pretty much any way they choose once they're adults, although they might be encouraged not to do that and invited not to do that. But yeah. I'm not a fan of compulsion for any reason. I think it is a sign of bad policy. If you and I can't play together voluntarily, then we don't have a very good relationship, and it's not going to be efficient and productive. It's going to require force to continue. And
I will take that analysis to commence our debate. Dr. Jordan Peterson, as always, fascinating. Thank you very much indeed for joining me.